The road wound like a serpent, climbing higher and higher into the Cascade Mountains. The asphalt had long given way to graded dirt, and my old pickup groaned in protest over every pothole. Giant Douglas firs flashed past the windows, their dark canopies nearly interlocking overhead, allowing only rare shafts of sunlight to pierce through, landing on the forest floor in trembling golden patches. When I rolled down the window, the air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and something else. Something ancient, wild, and inexplicably unsettling. I was headed to Whispering Peaks National Preserve, my new post, and, I hoped, my sanctuary. A refuge from the thumping roar of helicopter blades, the flash of explosions, and the faces frozen in their final grimaces. Ghosts that refused to stay buried in the sands of a distant country. Here, they promised me, there would be silence. An endless, pristine silence capable of healing, or at least quieting the noise inside me. My name is Elias Thorne, Ranger Veteran, a man trying to put himself back together far from the world that broke him. The ranger station was exactly as I'd pictured it, a sturdy log building with a sloped roof, nestled in a small clearing at the foot of one of the unnamed peaks. Nearby stood a small equipment shed and my future dwelling, a modest cabin set a little ways off. No smoke rose from the station's chimney. My future colleague must have been out on patrol. A note was pinned to the door, not with a thumbtack, but stabbed through with a hunting knife. A short welcome from Sarah Jenkins, a radio frequency, and a request to make myself at home. She'd be back by evening. I smirked. Tough country, tough ways of communicating. After unloading my few belongings, the first thing I did was walk around the cabin. Solid, well-built, smelling of wood and a faint hint of neglect. The windows looked directly out onto a wall of forest so dense and dark it seemed you could reach out and touch eternal night. The view was simultaneously captivating and oppressive. A habit etched into me over years of service made me automatically scan the tree line, noting potential cover approach routes. Stupid. Who would be approaching here, bears? Or the occasional lost hiker? I forced myself to relax, taking a deep breath of the cool air. The silence here was almost tangible. Not just the absence of sound, but something more. A dense, enveloping quietness of the ancient forest, broken only occasionally by the cry of an unfamiliar bird or the rustle of wind in the treetops. I unpacked, spread the area maps out on the old oak table, checked the radio. Everything worked. The silence pressed in, but it wasn't healing yet. It felt too attentive, as if the forest itself were listening to me. The newcomer sizing me up, weighing me. My gaze kept returning to the window, to the dark wall of trees. The sun began to sink towards the west, and the shadows in the clearing grew long, taking on bizarre, unsettling shapes. The peaks that gave the preserve its name truly seemed alive. Their gray, wind-scarred slopes caught the last rays, turning shades of crimson and violet. They weren't whispering. They were silent, and that silence was heavier than any scream. I felt like a speck at the foot of these stone giants, lost in a boundless green ocean. Maybe this was exactly what I needed, to feel insignificant, so the old scars would stop screaming so loudly. But something deep inside, an ancient survival instinct honed by war, whispered, "This silence is deceptive. This beauty hides teeth." The first few weeks passed in relative calm. I learned the trails, familiarizing myself with the map not on paper, but with my own boots, mended fences, cleared fallen trees. Sarah Jenkins turned out to be a tough, quiet woman who knew this forest like the back of her hand. She kept her distance, but she knew her job. Sheriff Brody from the nearest town dropped by a couple of times to chat, more out of curiosity than official business. A tall, heavy-set man with tired eyes, used to a jurisdiction where the worst incidents were usually a drunken brawl between loggers or a lost mushroom picker. I tried to be useful, inconspicuous, gradually settling into the rhythm of the preserve. The silence did begin to work its magic. The nights grew calmer, the flashbacks receded, replaced by merely heavy, murky dreams without clear plots. But the forest wasn't content to remain just a backdrop. The strangeness started subtly, creeping in. First, the animals. I was used to wildlife being skittish, avoiding humans. But here, it was different. Crows would sometimes gather on branches above the trail and silently track me with dozens of black beady eyes. They wouldn't caw or fly away, just sit and watch. One day I stumbled upon a herd of deer frozen in a meadow. They didn't bolt, even when I got quite close. They just stood there, heads turned towards me, their dark, liquid eyes seeming unnervingly intelligent. A chill ran down my spine from their silent attention. Then I started finding the marks. At first, I blamed hikers, vandals, several deep scratches on the bark of an old fir at a trail junction. But looking closer, I realized this wasn't a knife or an axe. The marks were ragged, as if made by claws, but their placement was too symmetrical, almost ritualistic. 3 vertical gouges, crossed by a single horizontal one. I saw the same marks in a couple of other places, always off the main trails, in the deepest parts of the woods. A photo of a smiling golden retriever appeared on the bulletin board by the ranger station. A tourist's dog had gone missing, slipped its leash near the north entrance to the park. Common enough, dogs get lost. But something about the notice bothered me. Maybe the desperation in the owner's eyes when they came personally to hang it up. Maybe the location marked on the map where the dog vanished, not far from where I'd seen one of the strange marks. At night, I started hearing sounds. Not the howl of a coyote or the hoot of an owl. I'd grown accustomed to those. This was something else. A quiet, intermittent whispering, like wind caught in the branches. But there was no wind. Sometimes the measured snapping of twigs deep in the thicket, too rhythmic for an animal, too quiet for a human. I'd step out of the cabin, peering into the darkness, but see only the impenetrable wall of trees and myriad stars in the velvet sky. The sounds would stop the moment I stepped outside. I told myself it was my imagination, fatigue, adjusting to the altitude. But that inner voice, the one that had saved my life more than once, insisted, "Listen closer." The forest had begun to speak, and it wasn't speaking the language of birds and beasts. It was the whisper of the land itself, ancient and incomprehensible, and it promised nothing good. The silence of whispering peaks wasn't empty. It was filled with anticipation. The unease took shape in early October when autumn had painted the mountain slopes in copper and crimson hues, and the morning fogs grew thick and cold. A hiker went missing. Not just lagging behind a group or delayed on the trail, vanished. David Miller, 35, an experienced backpacker, had set out on a solo 3-day trek along one of the remote routes. His car remained in the parking lot at the trailhead. He was 2 days overdue. Sheriff Brody organized a search. Me, Sarah, a couple of rangers from the next district over, volunteers from town, about 15 of us in total. We split into groups, combing sector by sector. The weather wasn't cooperating. The sky brooded. A fine, cold rain drizzled intermittently, and fog clung to the treetops, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. The forest, which had recently seemed merely wild and majestic, now felt different. Hostile. Every bush seemed like an ambush, every shadow a lurking threat. The silence grew tense, ringing. My old instincts were razor sharp. I moved slowly, scanning the ground, the tree trunks, listening for the slightest sound. My group followed a creek along Miller's presumed route. We found his boot prints fairly quickly, clear impressions in the damp earth. He had walked confidently, sticking to the trail. But after about 3 miles, the tracks became strange, less distinct, the stride uneven, as if the person had started to panic, looking back, thrashing around. And then they simply stopped. In a small, moss-covered clearing, the tracks ended abruptly. They didn't turn aside, didn't disappear into the bushes. They just ceased to exist, as if Miller had vanished into thin air. We meticulously searched every inch. Nothing. Not a broken branch, not a scrap of clothing, not a drop of blood. It was there, at the edge of that clearing, that I found it. The totem. It was thrust into the ground at the roots of an old cedar, almost hidden by ferns. Small, maybe a foot high, but it radiated such ancient, concentrated dread that I almost gagged. A crudely whittled branch, to which were tied with sinew or thin strips of leather several darkened bones. Bird bones, maybe some small animal, and a hank of long, dark hair. Human hair. It was dull, slightly damp from the rain, and gave off a faint, nauseating smell. Of fear? Or decay? I carefully picked it up, using a glove. The wood felt cold, and the hair greasy to the touch. I showed it to the others. The volunteers turned pale and recoiled. Even the seasoned ranger from the neighboring district shook his head, muttering something about bad omens. We continued searching until dark, but it was futile. David Miller was gone, as if the forest itself had taken him. As we walked back to the station, exhausted and depressed, I couldn't shake the image of that gruesome totem. It didn't look like the primitive craft of some lunatic. It felt purposeful, ritualistic. An ancient, dark power had left its mark at the site of the disappearance. And the hair, whose was it? Miller's or a previous victim, one nobody knew about? Questions swirled in my head, mixing with the cold drizzle and the scent of decaying leaves. I knew one thing for sure. The silence of whispering peaks had been broken. And this was only the beginning. The search for David Miller was officially called off after a week. The verdict: accidental death. Likely fell into a crevasse or succumbed to the elements. Body not recovered. Standard procedure for cases like this in the wilderness. But I knew it was a lie. I'd seen the totem, I'd felt the wrongness of the place where the tracks ended. Sheriff Brody clapped me sympathetically on the shoulder, advised me not to take it too hard, said the mountains take their toll. Sarah Jenkins withdrew even further, but in her eyes I saw a shadow of the same unease that gnawed at me. She knew this forest too well to believe in simple accidents. But no one dared to speak of it aloud, except for one person. I stumbled upon her dwelling by accident while patrolling a remote, rarely visited sector of the park, near the border with the reservation lands of the local tribe, known around here simply as the Coastal People. It wasn't really a cabin, more like a dugout built into the hillside, almost invisible among the roots and moss. Nearby was a small, well-tended garden and a lean-to stacked neatly with firewood. No smoke came from the chimney, but there was a sense of recent presence. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the woods, motionless as an old tree, watching me. An elderly woman with a face etched with wrinkles like oak bark and dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to see not just me but all my fears and memories. Her long gray hair was braided into 2 plaits. She was dressed simply. A dark skirt, a worn jacket, but carried herself with such dignity that I instinctively stood straighter. I approached, nodding a greeting. She didn't return it, just tilted her head slightly, continuing to study me with that piercing gaze. Silence hung between us, not awkward, but filled with meaning. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low but clear, like the sound of a stream running over stones. She gave her name, Alara. Said her people had lived on this land since time immemorial, longer than these peaks had stood. She knew about the missing hiker. Knew about my find the totem. She didn't ask. She stated it as fact. Her eyes darkened for a moment as if peering into an abyss. She explained that the forest remembers everything. It remembers the blood spilled here generations ago when outsiders came and massacred her people, desecrating sacred places. And this memory, this pain of the land, sometimes awakens. She spoke of spirits, disturbed and vengeful, and of him. The one her ancestors called the Skinwalker, a creature born of violence and grief, capable of taking any form, stealing not just life, but a person's very essence, their skin, their shape. It comes when the balance is disturbed, when disrespect for the land crosses a line. Her words sounded like an ancient legend, a campfire story told to frightened children. But looking into her eyes, I sensed no falsehood. She spoke of what she knew, what she believed with her entire being. She saw something in me, the echoes of violence I'd witnessed, the mark of war, that made me, she said, more attuned to what had awakened in the woods. Before I could ask questions, she held out a small, smooth black stone like obsidian but with faint reddish veins. She told me to carry it. It wouldn't protect me, but it might warn me. Warn me about what? She didn't elaborate, only added that I should be careful, especially at night, and listen not with my ears but with my heart. The forest hadn't chosen me by accident. With those words, she turned and melted silently back into the trees, leaving me alone with the cold stone in my hand and a whirlwind of unsettling thoughts. A fairy tale? The ravings of an old hermit? Or a terrible truth that carried the chill of the grave? I slipped the stone into my jacket pocket. It felt warm, or maybe I imagined it. The nights became an ordeal. I slept lightly, waking at the slightest noise outside the window. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It hummed with tension. The stone Alara had given me lay on the nightstand, and I imagined its dark surface sometimes grew warm for no reason. I tried to push away thoughts of the Skinwalker, dismissing Alara's story as local folklore, but the image of the gruesome totem and the emptiness where Miller's tracks vanished gave me no peace. And then I heard it, the howl. It happened deep in the night when the moon was hidden behind clouds, and the darkness was absolute, inky black. At first I mistook it for the distant cry of a coyote or wolf, though wolves were rare in this part of the Cascades. But the sound grew, drawing closer, and there was nothing animalistic about it. It was too high-pitched, vibrating at some unbearable frequency, yet simultaneously deep, seeming to rise from the very bowels of the earth. It rose and fell, shimmering with hideous, unnatural overtones that echoed with pain, rage, and hunger. The sound pierced to the bone, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It didn't just assault the ears, it felt physical, a vibration in my chest, a cold dread creeping up my spine. I leaped out of bed, ran to the window, trying to see anything in the impenetrable darkness. Nothing. Only the black silhouettes of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The howl echoed through the valley, bounced off the slopes of whispering peaks, and then ceased as abruptly as it had begun. A deafening silence fell. Even the crickets and night insects, usually filling the night with their chirping, went quiet. The entire forest held its breath. I stood at the window, heart pounding like a drum, palms sweating. That was no animal. No animal I knew could make that sound. My combat experience screamed. This was a threat signal, primal, a blood-curdling cry of a predator, but not one of this world. Alara's words about the Skinwalker no longer seemed like a fairy tale. They took on a chilling reality in that inhuman howl. I remembered the stone on the nightstand. Walking over, I touched it. It was distinctly warm, almost hot. A warning? Or a reaction to the proximity of whatever made that sound? I didn't go back to bed that night. I sat at the table with the map of the preserve, trying to pinpoint where the howl might have come from. The sound had been pervasive, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I pulled out the old files of park archival materials I'd brought from the station. Newspaper clippings about unexplained hiker disappearances decades ago, brief mentions of local legends, reports of strange animal behavior. Previously, they had seemed like scattered, irrelevant facts. Now they clicked into a sinister mosaic. The history of Whispering Peaks wasn't just written in ink on paper, but in blood on moss, in fear absorbed by the land itself. And that history was alive. It howled in the night, reminding us of its presence. I checked my service revolver, made sure it was loaded. It probably wouldn't do much against that, but its weight in my hand offered some small measure of confidence. Dawn was still a long way off, and the silence outside the window now seemed even more ominous than the howl itself. Several days passed after that night. The howl didn't return, but the tension didn't ease. I doubled my vigilance on patrol, scrutinizing every shadow, listening to every sound. I kept Alara's stone in my jacket pocket at all times now. It remained cool, but its smooth surface served as a constant reminder. I shared my concerns with Sarah, told her about the howl. She listened silently, her face unreadable, but she didn't dismiss it. Just remarked that some old-timers in town had also been talking about bad sounds at night recently. I decided not to tell Sheriff Brody yet. His skepticism was predictable. Trouble came from the north end of the park, from the Black Gorge area, a wild, rocky place where even experienced hikers rarely ventured. A married couple had gone there for a day hike and hadn't returned by evening. Their car was found in the small parking lot at the trailhead leading into the gorge. Another search. This time, the atmosphere was different. There wasn't the confusion that followed Miller's disappearance. There was fear. A quiet, oppressive fear in the eyes of the rangers and volunteers. Rumors about the howl and the strange occurrences had spread through the area. We found them the next day, on a small plateau above the gorge. Or rather, what was left of them. The man was found first. He lay face down near the edge of the cliff, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. But that wasn't the worst part. His hiking jacket and shirt were ripped open down his back, exposing the skin, or where the skin should have been. A large flap of it was missing, cut or torn away by something incredibly sharp, revealing a bloody mess of muscle underneath. The edges of the wound were strangely neat, almost precise. The woman was found a few yards away, huddled under a rock overhang. She was alive but in deep shock, eyes wide with terror, unresponsive to voices, just trembling violently and muttering incoherently about eyes and skin. She had no visible wounds, but her clothes were spattered with her husband's blood. While the others administered first aid and called for a helicopter evacuation, I examined the scene. My worst fears were being confirmed. Near the man's body, I found tracks. They were clear in the damp earth after the recent rain, and they were nightmarish. The prints started as heavy boot tracks, likely the attackers, but a few steps later they changed. The toes elongated, the heel disappeared, claw marks appeared. The print became wider, deeper, transforming into the track of a huge beast, but unlike any bear or cougar. Then, a couple of steps further, the tracks began to change again, shortening, regaining a vaguely human shape before vanishing on the rocky ground. The Skinwalker. The legend had come to life. On the branch of a nearby bush, I noticed a scrap of something dark. I carefully removed it. It wasn't fur or fabric. It was coarse, stiff, like poorly tanned hide or parchment with sparse black hairs thick as bristles. It smelled of dampness, blood, and something else. A musky, wild, nauseating predator scent. I sealed the piece of evidence in a bag. The man's knife lay nearby, a standard hiking knife, useless against this enemy. I picked it up, and just then, Alara's stone in my pocket grew noticeably warm. I froze, scanning the surroundings. The forest around us fell silent. That oppressive, watching silence again. It had been here, recently, or was it still watching? I felt eyes on my back, the icy breath of ancient horror. We needed to get out of here, get the woman to safety before she became the next victim, or before she recovered enough to tell a story that would drive her, and anyone who heard it, mad. I took several photos of the tracks and the scene with my phone. Evidence. Weak, circumstantial. But it was all I had, and the cold certainty, the hunt had begun. After the horrific discovery in Black Gorge, the atmosphere in the preserve became unbearable. There were hardly any tourists, the few who came stuck to the main trails and left well before dark. Sarah walked around like a thundercloud, constantly checking her radio. Sheriff Brody, though trying to maintain composure, was clearly frightened. The official story became an attack by a man-eating cougar, abnormally large and aggressive, but none of us believed it. The woman they found alive never fully recovered. She was transferred to a psychiatric facility in the city, her incoherent ramblings about skin takers dismissed by doctors as PTSD. Brody politely acknowledged my photos of the tracks and the piece of hide, but made it clear they wouldn't be part of the official report. Too wild. Too inconvenient. I realized waiting for help was pointless. If I wanted to stop this, I had to act alone. I began systematically combing the areas where strange things had happened. The totem sites, the area where I heard the howl, Black Gorge. I moved cautiously, using every survival and camouflage skill I possessed, skills learned not in peaceful forests but in combat zones. I was looking for a lair, or at least fresh tracks. Alara's stone in my pocket became my barometer. It warmed whenever I neared the bad places. One evening, as the sun bled into the peaks, painting the sky in bloody hues, the stone grew almost hot. I was in a dense fir grove, several miles from Black Gorge, far from any known trail. The air was still and heavy. I heard a sound, a soft snap of twigs ahead, then something like a choked groan. I froze, ducking behind the trunk of a massive fir, melting into the shadows. I peered out carefully. About 50 yards away, in a small clearing, I saw a figure. A man. He was on his knees, back towards me, shoulders shaking. He wore hiking clothes similar to David Miller's. Could it be him? Alive? I almost called out, but something stopped me. His posture was unnatural, convulsive. He was making strange, gurgling sounds as if choking. And then something happened that burned itself into my memory forever. The man arched violently, throwing his head back. His back bulged beneath his jacket, rippling. There was a sickening, wet, tearing sound of fabric and skin. The man screamed, or maybe it wasn't a human scream anymore, a wild, unbearable cry filled with agony. The jacket split open down his back. From the tear emerged something dark, glistening, pulsating. The skin on the man's back began to peel downwards like a stocking, revealing something indescribably nightmarish underneath. It didn't look like muscle or bone. It was different flesh, grayish-green, lumpy, covered in slime. The figure's limbs began to elongate, changing shape with the nauseating crunch of breaking and rearranging bones. Fingers stretched into claws. The head jerked, the face distorted, twisting into an elongated, lipless muzzle with rows of small, sharp teeth. The shed human skin lay in a formless heap at its feet. I watched, paralyzed by horror, unable to look away or move. Breath caught in my throat. The creature, the Skinwalker, straightened up. It was taller and thinner than a man, moving with jerky, puppet-like motions. It turned its head towards me. It had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets, but I felt it see me. It emitted a low, gurgling sound like a chuckle and took a step in my direction. Survival instinct finally kicked in. I snatched out my revolver, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Fired once, twice, aiming for the center of the dark figure. Bullets thudded dully against its hide, causing no visible harm. The creature only paused momentarily, tilting its head as if studying me with curiosity. And then it lunged. The leap was incredibly fast, animalistic. I stumbled back, tripped over a root, and fell hard. The creature flew past, landing where I'd just stood, and turned towards me again, opening its fanged maw. I scrambled away, got to my feet, and bolted through the trees, running blindly, driven by pure animal terror. I didn't hear pursuit, but I felt its presence behind me, cold breath on my neck. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. Collapsing into a thicket of ferns, I lay still, listening. Silence. Only my own frantic heartbeat and the rush of blood in my ears. It hadn't followed. Or was it just playing with me? I stayed there for a long time, not daring to move, until dusk thickened into night. I had seen it. I had seen the transformation. The Skinwalker was real, and it knew I had seen it. Returning to the station felt like waking from a nightmare, only the nightmare wasn't over. I was covered in dirt, my clothes torn to shreds from crashing through the brush, scratches on my hands and face. But the worst part was the look in my eyes, wild, haunted, the look of someone who has stared into the abyss. Sarah met me at the door, her face pale. She knew immediately something terrible had happened. I tried to tell her. The words stumbled out, my voice breaking. Transformation, peeling skin, empty sockets, gunshots, the chase. I spoke incoherently, gesturing, trying to convey the unspeakable horror. Sarah listened silently, not interrupting. There was no disbelief in her eyes, more like a grim confirmation of her own worst fears. The next day, I drove into town to see Sheriff Brody. I brought everything I had. The photos of the strange tracks, the baggie with the piece of grotesque hide, the spent casings from my revolver I'd retrieved from the clearing, and most importantly, my story. I tried to speak calmly, methodically, like reporting intel during a briefing. Describe the transformation, the creature's appearance, its resistance to bullets. Brody listened, frowning, turning the baggie with the hide over in his hands. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the peaceful town street. Then he sighed heavily. He said he believed that I believed what I saw, but officially he couldn't do anything. No body, no concrete evidence, just the account of a veteran who, he delicately implied, might not be fully recovered from past trauma. My words would go into an unsolved case file, and the official cougar story would stand. Otherwise, panic would erupt. The preserve would be closed, his own career ruined. He advised me to take some leave, rest, get myself together. I walked out of his office feeling a dull sense of despair and rage. Isolation. That's what I felt. The world went on with its life, refusing to acknowledge the horror lurking just nearby in the shadow of the ancient peaks. They preferred a convenient lie to the terrible truth. That meant I was on my own. Returning to the preserve, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was enemy territory, the Skinwalker's territory. I knew it was aware of me now. It had seen me, let me escape. Why? Was it toying with me or biding its time? The only person who might understand and possibly help was Alara. I went to her dwelling the next day. She was waiting as if she knew I'd come. Sitting on a log near the entrance to her dugout, sorting through some dried herbs. I told her everything, leaving out no detail. She listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she looked at me with those fathomless eyes. She said I had seen the true face of the ancient spirit, disturbed by blood and forgetfulness. The fact that it had taken Miller's form was no accident. It uses the shells of its victims, their fears, their memories. Its resistance to conventional weapons was also part of its nature. It wasn't entirely physical. It was a concentration of this land's pain and fury. She didn't know how to kill it. Perhaps it was impossible. But she said it had weaknesses. Its power was tied to places of old blood, to desecrated sites, and it feared, or rather respected, certain symbols and rituals of her people. She gave me a bundle of dried herbs with a pungent smell, sage, and told me to burn it in the cabin and carry some with me. She said it wouldn't stop it, but might make me less visible to it, mask my scent, my fear. She also drew a complex symbol on a piece of bark, an interweaving of lines resembling both a tree and a spiral. She said it was an ancient symbol of protection and balance. I needed to remember it. I left Alara's place with a heavy heart. I had more knowledge, but no more comfort. I was alone against the nightmare, armed only with a bundle of herbs, a drawing on bark, and a desperate will to survive. A few days of uneasy quiet followed my visit to Alara. I smudged the cabin with sage. Its sharp smoke calmed my nerves slightly, though I wasn't sure of its real power. I copied the symbol from the bark into my notebook, trying to memorize every line. The forest was silent, but it was a heavy silence, like the calm before a storm. I patrolled, avoiding places where Alara's stone began to warm, but I felt like prey being stalked by an unseen hunter. And then Sarah disappeared. She'd gone out for a routine patrol of the park's northern perimeter, the same area containing Black Gorge where I'd witnessed the transformation. She was due back by lunch, but her radio remained silent. By evening, it was clear. The worst had happened. This time, Sheriff Brody didn't hesitate. The disappearance of a ranger was a different level of emergency. He assembled a search party, me, himself, 2 of his deputies, and 3 sturdy local volunteers armed with hunting rifles. Brody was grim, his usual skepticism gone, replaced by poorly concealed fear. He gave a brief, tense instruction, emphasizing caution and sticking together. He didn't mention anything supernatural, but everyone understood what we might be facing. We set out at dawn, following Sarah's route. Her tracks were clear. She'd walked confidently until she reached the area where the forest grew particularly dense and gloomy. Here, her trail became confused. She had clearly veered off the path, perhaps hearing or seeing something. We followed her tracks deeper into the thicket. The air grew colder, smelling of dampness and rot, and then the fog rolled in. It appeared suddenly, as if exhaled by the earth itself. Thick, white, cold, instantly swallowing visibility. You couldn't see 10 feet ahead, just swirling white mist. We stopped, huddled together. Brody cursed under his breath. The silence became absolute, the fog absorbing all sound. Then a cry cut through the white veil. It was Sarah's voice, calling for help, coming from somewhere to our right, very close. One of the volunteers, a young guy, impulsively dashed in that direction. Brody yelled for him to stop, but it was too late. A moment later, a short, gurgling cry came from that spot, and then silence. We froze, weapons ready, peering into the fog. Nothing. Then to our left, the sound of crashing branches. Someone or something was forcing its way through the brush, approaching. Brody shouted, demanding identification, silence in response. And then a shadow darted out of the mist. Indistinct, jerky silhouette, taller than a man. One of the deputies raised his shotgun, fired both barrels. The roar was swallowed by the fog. The shadow vanished. But a second later, there was a sickening thud and a low groan. The deputy collapsed, clutching his throat where blood was gushing. Chaos erupted. The fog was disorienting, the enemy unseen. Another shot rang out, then a cry of pain, one of the volunteers. I heard the familiar gurgling sound, the same one the creature made in the clearing. It was here, among us, toying with us like a cat with mice. I yelled at Brody for everyone to get down, fire at movement. I pressed myself against a tree trunk, trying to see anything. Another shadow flickered past. I fired the revolver. No effect. A voice came from the fog, Sarah's voice, calling my name, pleading for help, saying she was hurt. It came from the left, but I knew it was a lie. The creature was mimicking her voice. The stone in my pocket burned against my skin. I remembered Alara's symbol, visualized it. I don't know if it helped, but the panic receded slightly, replaced by cold fury. I reloaded the revolver, listening to the sounds of the fight. Screams, gunshots, snarls, the crack of breaking bones. An ambush, a classic ambush in zero visibility. We had walked right into it. The fight in the fog was brief, but incredibly brutal. The sounds of agony, random gunshots, the creature's snarls, and its nauseating vocal mimicry blended into a cacophony of terror. I fired several times towards movement or sound, unsure if I hit anything or if I hit one of our own. At one point, a body crashed down beside me. One of the volunteers, his chest torn open. I dragged him behind the tree, but he wasn't breathing. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything fell silent. The shooting stopped, the screams cut off. Only my own heavy breathing remained, and the distant, fading crash of branches somewhere deep in the fog. It was gone. The fog began to lift, dissipating in wisps, revealing the scene of carnage. The clearing was littered with bodies. Of the 7 who had set out, only 2 were standing, me and Sheriff Brody. He sat on the ground, leaning against a tree, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped out. His face was ashen gray, eyes staring into nothing. The others were dead. The deputies? The volunteers? Their bodies lay in unnatural poses, some torn apart with monstrous force. We never found Sarah. Not alive, not dead. As if she had never been there. I went to Brody, checked his wound. Ragged, deep, like claw marks. Not fatal, but he'd lost a lot of blood. I bandaged him as best I could with a first aid kit from one of the dead. We were silent. What could be said? We had survived by a miracle, or had it simply lost interest in us? Or taken what it came for, Sarah? I scanned the clearing more closely. The creature's tracks were everywhere. Deep claw prints interspersed with the boot prints of its victims. But there were no tracks leading away showing where it went. It had simply vanished, dissolved into the forest as suddenly as it had emerged from the fog. Not a drop of its blood, not a scrap of its hide. Nothing. As if it had never been there except for the bodies around us. The feeling of being watched, however, hadn't left. The surrounding forest was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a lurking predator. Every rustle made me jump. We were in the heart of its territory, wounded, low on ammo, surrounded by our dead comrades. We had to get out. Brody, leaning heavily on me, struggled to his feet. We couldn't carry out all the dead. It was impossible. We took their weapons, their radios, all silent, broken or simply dead, and started back the way we came. The trek back felt endless. Every step was an effort. Brody groaned in pain. I supported him, constantly glancing back, listening, expecting another attack. But none came. The forest silently watched our retreat. When we finally emerged from the fog zone and reached more open ground, the sun was high. We were exhausted, devastated, covered in blood, our own and others. The horror of what we'd endured tightened like a steel band around my throat. We didn't reach the vehicles until evening. Brody needed a hospital. I needed to process what had happened. The Skinwalker didn't just kill. It hunted. It played. And it wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent and incredibly powerful. I looked at the darkening peaks, feeling a chill seep into my bones despite the warm evening. It was out there, and it knew we had survived. Returning to civilization felt surreal. The wounded Brody was immediately sent to the county hospital. I had to give statements, first to my fellow rangers, then to the state police who arrived to investigate the deaths of so many people, including sheriff's deputies. I told them everything as it happened. The ambush in the fog, the attack by an unknown creature, its speed, strength, voice mimicry. I talked about the tracks, the previous incidents, Alara's story. They listened. They wrote it down, they nodded, but I saw it in their eyes. Disbelief, pity, suspicion. The official story began to form almost immediately. An abnormally aggressive grizzly bear, though none had been seen here in 50 years, or a wolf pack, also unlikely. A tragic confluence of events. Poor visibility. Possibly friendly fire in the panic. Anything but the truth. The truth was too monstrous to acknowledge. Brody, when he recovered slightly, only partially corroborated my story. He mentioned the fog, the attack by a large animal, the chaos. He said nothing about a Skinwalker. Maybe out of fear of sounding crazy, maybe due to shock. His silence effectively buried my version of events. I became the guy whose testimony could not be fully trusted due to potential post-traumatic stress. My past worked against me. I wasn't just a witness, I was an unreliable witness. The legends of the Skinwalker were dismissed as local folklore, irrelevant to the case. The investigation quickly hit a dead end and was quietly closed. Attack by unidentified predator. Case closed. I felt hollow, betrayed. The system I had once served had turned its back again, preferring a convenient lie. I went to see Alara again. She met me with sad understanding in her eyes. She already knew the official version, said it had always been this way. People fear what they don't understand and prefer to ignore the darkness under their noses. She confirmed my fears. The creature wasn't defeated. It had achieved its goal, sowed fear, taken its victim, Sarah, whose body was never found, shown its power, and retreated into the shadows again. It wasn't dead. It was just waiting. It's part of this land, born of its pain. It can wait decades, centuries. It's patient. Alara said that until the wound on this land, the memory of the massacre, the disrespect is healed, the Skinwalker will return. She offered no false hope, no magic way to kill it. Only advised me to honor the land, remember the past, and be vigilant. Knowledge was my only weapon now. Knowledge and respect. I left her with a heavy heart, but with a new clarity. My war hadn't ended in distant sands. It was continuing here in Whispering Peaks. And the enemy was far older and more terrifying than anything I had faced before. Several months passed. Autumn gave way to a wet, raw winter, then yielded to a tentative spring. Life in the preserve and the surrounding area slowly returned to its routine, but the scar remained. Whispering Peaks National Preserve was technically open, but its dark reputation had done its work. Tourists were significantly fewer. Those who came stuck to the central, easily visible trails and left long before dusk. Locals avoided the northern sections of the park, especially Black Gorge, now considered a cursed place. Sarah was no longer mentioned. Her name became synonymous with a tragedy best left undisturbed. Sheriff Brody returned to work, but his shoulder never fully healed and a permanent fear resided in his eyes. We barely spoke. The chasm of unspoken truth lay between us. I stayed at my post. To leave would mean surrender, abandoning this place to the darkness. My purpose had changed. I came here seeking peace and found a new war, a quiet, unseen, perhaps endless one. I was no longer just a ranger. I was a guardian, keeper of knowledge no one wanted to hear. My routine became a perpetual watch. I patrolled the woods with senses honed to their sharpest edge. I marked strange occurrences on my map, unusual tracks, places where birds fell silent, areas where Alara's stone warmed in my pocket. I studied old maps, archives, books on the history and mythology of the region's indigenous tribes, trying to understand the creature's nature, its cycles, its weaknesses. I stayed in touch with Alara, visiting her occasionally, learning from her about respect for the land, its spirits, its memory. I no longer sought battle. I understood Alara's words. Killing the Skinwalker might be impossible. It's a symptom of the land's sickness. But one can be prepared. One can watch. One can warn. One can face it if it returns, not with panic, but with knowledge and respect for its power, yet with a firm resolve to defend what little balance remains. It's evening now. I stand at the window of my cabin, the one that was supposed to be my sanctuary. I look out at the majestic, darkening silhouettes of the Whispering Peaks. Their summits are veiled in a light mist creeping up from the gorges, like the breath of a sleeping giant. The forest outside the window is dense, dark, full of secrets, beautiful and deadly. I no longer fear it as I once did. Fear has been replaced by wary attention, constant readiness. Somewhere deep in the thicket, a sound. The sharp crack of a dry branch, too loud for a squirrel or a deer, too close. I freeze, listening. The wind, or not? My heart gives a momentary lurch, a chill of recognition. Silence. Only the rustle of wind in the treetops. Or is it the wind? I reach for the radio on the table. Check the load in my revolver. My watch continues. Here in Whispering Peaks, where an ancient horror sleeps fitfully and the silence is full of unspoken threats. And I don't know when it will wake again, but I'll be waiting. Story 2. The Inheritance. Uncle David's funeral was held under a low gray Maine sky. The air was damp and cold, smelling of decaying leaves and rain. There weren't many of us. Me, Samuel Bramley, my aunts Mary and Helen, Dad's and Uncle David's sisters, Mary's husband, Uncle Robert, and their son Tyler, my cousin, who was always sniffling from some allergy or another. Grief hung heavy in the air, an invisible shroud, but beneath it you could feel something else, a lingering bewilderment stemming from the deceased's way of life. Uncle David had always been a recluse, a man of the woods, choosing solitude in a small cabin somewhere deep in the sticks, far from civilization, and it seemed, from us. He rarely showed up at family gatherings, and his visits were always brief and slightly awkward. In recent years, he'd stopped emerging from his forest refuge altogether. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but something about the hasty conclusion and lack of detail felt strange. The reading of the will was a complete shock to me. While my aunts and uncle received token amounts and some old possessions, I, the nephew Uncle David had seen maybe 5 times in my entire conscious life, inherited the very cabin in the woods. I sat there, listening to the lawyer's monotone voice, trying to process it. College life in the city demanded money I never had enough of. Rent for my tiny apartment devoured most of my budget, and now, a whole house. Old maybe, and out in the middle of nowhere, but mine. The idea of moving there for the summer to prep for exams seemed like salvation. Quiet, solitude, fresh air, perfect study conditions, or so I naively assumed. The drive took longer than I expected. The map led me down increasingly narrow and neglected roads until the pavement turned to gravel, and then finally to a rutted forest track. I drove the last few miles in almost total darkness, the headlights snatching only tree trunks from the gloom, standing like a solid wall on either side. A couple of times I thought I saw tall, unnaturally thin silhouettes flitting between the pines, moving parallel to the car. I blinked, peered harder, but saw only tangled branches and the play of shadows. Just fatigue, I decided. Long drive. The stress of the past few days. The cabin appeared out of the darkness suddenly, a low-slung, dark building with a peaked roof, almost merging with the surrounding forest. It stood in a small clearing overgrown with tall grass. The air was thick, smelling of pine and damp earth. I unlocked the old, warped door with the key the lawyer had given me. Inside, it smelled of dust, wood, and something else. A faint, barely perceptible, musty odor like an old storage closet. I had no energy left for inspection. I dragged in a couple of bags with essentials, found a light switch, tossed my sleeping bag onto the dusty sofa in the living room, and crashed almost instantly, not even bothering to lock the door properly. The woods outside were silent, or so it seemed through the fog of exhaustion. Morning greeted me with bright sunlight slanting through dusty windows and a deafening silence. After the constant noise of the city, the stillness felt almost physical. I crawled out of the sleeping bag, stretching my stiff muscles. In daylight, the cabin didn't look too bad. Sturdy log walls, simple but solid furniture, a fireplace in the corner of the living room. Dusty, sure, and cobwebs in the corners, but perfectly livable. I made coffee on the ancient gas stove and slapped together a couple of sandwiches from the supplies I'd brought. Eating by the window, I looked out at the forest. The trees pressed right up against the house, their branches nearly touching the walls. It felt completely secluded, isolated even. Exactly what I needed for studying, I told myself. To settle in a bit and break the oppressive silence, I got out my laptop and put on a Netflix show. Familiar sounds filled the room, creating an illusion of the normal world. I started unpacking a box of books when a strange sound reached me, a short, sharp bark or whine, very plaintive. At first I thought it was from the show, some sound effect. But it came again, louder this time, cutting through the dialogue on screen. I paused the playback. Silence. Then again, the same mournful, whimpering sound, now clearly coming from outside, from the direction of the woods. It sounded like an animal in distress nearby, maybe a dog. Had one of the few neighbors lost a pet? Or was it a wild animal? Curiosity, mixed with an underlying unease, made me step outside. I walked around the clearing, peering into the dense woods. The forest stood motionless, bathed in morning light, yet seemed impenetrable and full of secrets. I called out, trying to coax the supposed dog, but only silence answered. The sound didn't repeat. I walked a little way along the edge of the trees, scanning the ground for tracks, but found nothing. Back at the cabin, I checked the windows and door. Everything was secure. No sign that anyone or anything had come close. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I continued unpacking, trying to get organized and create a workspace. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the sound, or maybe it was a coyote that had wandered too close to human habitation. In the evening, as the sun began to set and the forest sank into deep shadows, I heard a distant echo of that same mournful bark again. It was quieter, farther away, but unmistakably the same. I went to the window, staring into the darkening woods. Anxiety stirred inside me, cold and unpleasant, but exhaustion from cleaning and unpacking took over. I decided not to dwell on it, blaming an overactive imagination in unfamiliar surroundings. I locked the door securely, checked the windows, and tried to focus on my studies, pushing away the uneasy thoughts. But somewhere deep down, doubt lingered. Something about this forest silence felt wrong. The next morning, around 10, the sound returned. This time it was loud, distinct, and continuous. A desperate, terrified dog's bark mixed with whimpers. It came from the same direction in the woods as before, but sounded much closer and more insistent now. Ignoring it was impossible. Something was clearly wrong. Pulling on sturdy boots, I left the house and headed determinedly towards the barking. The forest met me with a dense wall of trees and underbrush. I pushed through branches, guided by the sound, which sometimes faded, then erupted with renewed intensity. After about a quarter of a mile, I broke through into a small clearing littered with fallen trees. And there, tangled in thorny blackberry bushes, sat a dirty, trembling Labrador puppy. His golden fur was matted with burrs, mud, and dark patches that looked like dried blood. A long scratch marred his side, and one paw was held at an unnatural angle. Seeing me, the puppy whimpered even more pitifully, but tried to muster a growl, showing a last shred of bravery. His eyes were filled with fear and pain. My heart ached with pity. I approached cautiously, trying not to frighten him further, speaking in a low, soothing voice. It took several minutes for him to stop growling and allow me near. Carefully untangling him from the bushes, I scooped the puppy into my arms. He was light, clearly malnourished. His fur felt cold and damp. I examined his wounds. The scratch on his side wasn't too deep, but looked painful. The paw was also concerning. He needed to see a vet, urgently. The nearest clinic, according to online maps, was in a town about 5 miles away. Without hesitation, I carried the puppy back towards the house. He quieted in my arms, only occasionally trembling. At the vet's office, an elderly man with kind eyes determined the puppy was young, maybe 5 or 6 months old. He wasn't chipped. The doctor cleaned the scratch, put in a few stitches, and examined the paw. Luckily, no break, just a bad bruise. He prescribed antibiotics, pain medication, and ointment for the wound. Looking at the miserable little creature pressed trustingly against me, I knew I couldn't just dump him at a shelter. I decided to keep him. The vet nodded approvingly, seeming to have hoped for this outcome. I asked if he had a name, but of course got no answer. I had to come up with one. Cooper. For some reason, the name popped into my head immediately. Cooper. On the way back, I stopped at a pet supply store, bought the necessities: 2 bowls, food and water, a bag of puppy chow, a few toys, a soft bed, and a leash and collar. Returning to Uncle David's cabin, the first thing I did was give Cooper a warm bath. The dirt and dried blood washed away, revealing a charming golden lab, albeit one with a bandage on his side and a limp. I fed him, gave him his medicine. Cooper devoured the food greedily, then, exhausted, curled up on his new bed near the fireplace and fell instantly asleep. Watching him, I felt the loneliness in the cabin recede a bit. Now there were two of us. The first strange thing happened a couple of days after Cooper arrived. I woke up feeling a draft. Opening my eyes, I saw the front door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. Cold morning air filled the living room. My heart leapt. I distinctly remembered locking it the night before with the deadbolt and key. Nearby on the bed by the fireplace was empty space. Cooper was gone. Panic washed over me like an icy wave. I scrambled onto the porch, frantically looking around, shouting his name. The forest stood silent, still. Had he run off? Or had something taken him? The thought that something might have entered the house while I slept made my blood run cold. I dashed to the edge of the woods, still calling the puppy, my voice cracking with fear. And then I saw him. Cooper trotted out from behind a thick patch of ferns, tail wagging happily, a small twig in his mouth. He ran up to me, nudging my hand with his nose. The relief was so intense my legs almost buckled. I hugged him, checking him over. Safe and sound. But how had he gotten out? Had I forgotten to lock the door? I was sure I had. Examining the door more closely, I found no signs of forced entry. The deadbolt was slid back, the key turned in the lock. Chalking it up to my own absent-mindedness and fatigue, I brought Cooper inside and locked the door again, this time double-checking everything. A few days later, the weather turned nasty. During our usual afternoon walk on a forest trail, the sky suddenly filled with strange, heavy clouds. Instead of the usual gray or blue, it took on a sickly yellow-brown hue, as if lit from within by some putrid light. A strong, gusty wind kicked up, swaying the tops of the pines with an ominous creak. The atmosphere became oppressive, anxious. I remembered seeing a similar sky once, years ago, on a trip through the Great Plains. Locals then had spoken of some rare dust storm phenomenon. But here in the Maine woods it looked utterly unnatural and sinister. Cooper whined, pressing against my legs. We hurried back to the cabin just as a downpour mixed with small hail began. That night I woke to a low, persistent whining. Cooper was sitting by the front door, the fur on his neck bristled, growling softly as he stared at the door. I got up, went to the window, trying to see anything through the curtain of rain in the darkness. Nothing. Just black tree silhouettes and the roar of the downpour. Maybe deer had come close to the house? Or a raccoon trying to get into the trash can? I tried to soothe Cooper, petted him, told him everything was okay. But he kept whining anxiously and wouldn't leave the door until I finally put his bed next to mine. Falling asleep to the sound of the storm, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the darkness, that something hostile was prowling nearby, waiting. In the morning, after the storm had passed and the sun peeked out, I stepped onto the porch to assess the damage, and froze. On the massive wooden door I had so carefully locked last night, 3 deep parallel scratches gaped. They were huge, nearly 10 inches long each, gouged into the wood almost an inch deep. The edges were ragged and splintered, as if left by something with incredible strength and razor-sharp claws. I ran a finger along one of the grooves, feeling the rough texture of the torn wood. A chill ran down my spine. Definitely not a deer, and not a bear. The marks were too narrow and deep for bear claws. What kind of creature could leave marks like these? My thoughts scrambled, fear beginning to coil in my stomach again. The door was seriously damaged. nearly gouged through in several places. I knew I couldn't wait. I found the number for a local repair service in the phone book and called them. 2 sturdy men arrived a couple of hours later in an old pickup. Examining the door, they shook their heads, their faces serious. One of them, older, with a weathered face and calloused hands, gave me a searching look and muttered something about how all sorts of things happen in these woods, and it wouldn't hurt to have something for self-defense. Something more serious than a kitchen knife. His words, spoken quietly without a smile, sounded less like advice and more like a warning. They quickly and skillfully replaced the damaged door with a new, sturdier one, advising me to install an additional deadbolt. Their words stuck with me. Anxiety for myself and for Cooper grew with every hour. The thought of something strong and aggressive roaming so close was unnerving. That same day, I drove to the nearest town with a gun shop. I'd never held a weapon before, aside from an air rifle as a kid. But now I felt it was necessary. The clerk, after listening to my stumbling explanations about wild animals, helped me choose a small but reliable handgun and a box of ammunition. I received brief instructions on handling and care. Holding the cold weight of the metal, I felt slightly more confident, but also much more afraid. The very act of buying a gun underscored the seriousness of the threat. Back home, I'd tried to return to my routine, studying, walking Cooper, cooking, but the tension wouldn't leave. I constantly listened to the sounds of the forest, jumping at every rustle. Cooper was on edge too. He often stopped during walks, head up, sniffing the air and growling softly at the trees. He no longer ran carefree in the clearing, preferring to stay close to me or the cabin. In the evening, sitting with a book by the fireplace, I kept glancing at the new door, at the handgun lying on a nearby shelf. Peace had fled this house. Dreadful anticipation of something terrible had taken its place. The next morning, I decided to walk Cooper a bit farther than usual, down a trail leading deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my head and shake off the gloomy thoughts. We were gone for about an hour. When we returned, I stopped dead in my tracks a few yards from the cabin. The new, sturdy front door had been torn clean off its hinges and lay on the grass several feet from the opening, snapped in half like a matchstick. The gaping blackness of the doorway stared back at me like an empty eye socket. My stomach plummeted. I grabbed the handgun, which I now carried on walks, and slowly, trying to be quiet, approached the house. Cooper growled low, pressing against my legs. Inside was chaos. Someone or something had utterly trashed the place. The walls were scarred with the same horrific claw marks as the previous door. Furniture was overturned and ripped to shreds. The sofa upholstery hung in tatters, stuffing spilling from the cushions. Books were swept from shelves and scattered across the floor. But the worst was in the kitchen. The refrigerator door was torn off, its contents dumped onto the floor. Cartons of milk and juice were ripped open, vegetables and fruits crushed. But significantly, all the meat I had bought the day before was gone. Steaks, chicken, ground beef. Only empty, torn packaging remained. This creature was clearly looking for food, specifically flesh. I slowly walked through the wrecked living room, nausea rising in my throat. Then my gaze fell on the sofa. On what remained of a cushion lay the remains of a small, mangled body, a squirrel, or maybe a rabbit. Tufts of gray fur, tiny bones, dark stains of blood. It had left this here, like an offering or a warning. Bile rose in my throat. I stumbled outside, barely suppressing the urge to vomit. Cooper whined beside me, nudging my hand with his wet nose. After pulling myself together somewhat, I went back inside, found a shovel in the shed, and carefully gathered the squirrel's remains. I buried it under an old pine at the edge of the clearing, making a small mound of stones. This small ritual felt important, the only thing I could do in the face of such senseless brutality. That was it. Enough. This wasn't just strange occurrences or wild animals anymore. This was something evil, dangerous, and it clearly considered this cabin its territory. I had to leave. Immediately. I began frantically gathering my things, shoving what little had survived the rampage into bags. But I quickly realized I wouldn't make it out before dark. The sun was already sinking, painting the sky in blood-red hues. Dragging the broken door back into the frame was pointless, but I managed to prop it somewhat against the jamb, bracing it from inside with the surviving table to create at least the semblance of a barrier. One more night awaited me in this cursed house. A night with a gun in my hand and a gaping hole for a door, waiting for the return of whatever left its gruesome trophy on the sofa. The night stretched on endlessly. I sat in the armchair, back to the wall, handgun in my lap. Cooper lay at my feet, shifting restlessly and whimpering softly in his sleep. Every creak from the precariously propped door made me jump. Moonlight filtered through the cracks and broken windows, creating bizarre shadows that seemed to move on their own. Around 3 a.m, Cooper shot up. The fur along his spine bristled. He let out a low, guttural growl, eyes fixed on the propped door. I heard it too, a scraping sound. A slow, dragging scrape of claws on wood from outside. Then, a soft, whistling sigh that made the hair on my arms stand up. And the smell, a disgusting, nauseating stench of rot, carrion, and something else indescribable began to seep into the room. I held my breath, trying to see something through the crack between the door and the frame. And I saw it. An eye. A yellow, pupilless eye glowing in the darkness, staring intently inside. Then it shifted, and I saw part of a face, or what passed for one. A skull stretched taut with gray, parchment-like skin with teeth like sharp needles protruding from beneath tattered lips. Above the skull rose crooked, branching antlers like a deer's, but somehow wrong, deformed. The creature sighed again, and the smell of decay intensified. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long, bony limbs ending in huge claws. Wendigo. The legend of the northern woods had come to life and was standing just outside my door. The next second, an explosive crack echoed through the room. The creature slammed into the door with incredible force. Planks splintered. The table bracing it flew sideways. The door crashed inward. Standing in the opening was the thing itself, a nightmare made flesh, radiating stench and cold. It stepped into the room, its glowing eyes fixing on me. Panic froze me for a split second. But Cooper's snarl and the sight of the sharp claws snapped me back to reality. I raised the pistol and squeezed the trigger. The shot roared deafeningly in the confined space. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder. It shrieked an inhuman, blood-curdling sound, and staggered back. I fired again, aiming for its chest, and again. The Wendigo shrieked once more. Dark, thick fluid oozed from the wounds on its gray hide. It looked at me with unutterable malice, took a step back, then another, and slipped back out into the darkness of the forest. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Adrenaline surged through me. Grabbing the bag with essentials, scooping up the trembling Cooper, I burst out the back door, which thankfully was still intact. The car was only a few dozen yards away, but it felt like miles. I threw Cooper and the bag into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, fumbling with the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Flipping on the headlights, I saw it again. The Wendigo burst from the trees to the right of the car, moving with unnatural speed on its long legs. It lunged to cut me off. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The car shot forward, tires screaming on the wet grass. I saw its silhouette flashing between the trees in the rearview mirror, but I was already tearing down the forest track, gaining speed, racing away from that cursed place, from the nightmare made real. After hours of frantic driving, when the forest finally gave way to the first signs of civilization, I knew where to go. To Aunt Helen's. Mary had Tyler with his allergies. Cooper wouldn't work there. Helen's house seemed the only safe haven. I pulled up to Aunt Helen's neat little house on the outskirts of a small town just before dawn. My hands were shaking. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. The full horror of the night washed over me again. Cooper whimpered softly on the seat beside me, nose pressed against my side. I killed the engine and just sat for several minutes, trying to compose myself. The house looked so peaceful, so ordinary: trimmed lawn, flower beds, a light on in the kitchen window. The contrast with what I'd left behind was stark. Aunt Helen opened the door almost immediately, pulling a robe on over her nightgown. Seeing me, disheveled, wild-eyed dog in my arms, she froze on the doorstep. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern. She let me in without asking questions, her eyes worriedly taking in my state. She led me to the kitchen, poured me hot tea. Her calmness and the cozy, homey atmosphere settled my nerves slightly. Sitting at the table, I tried to explain what had happened. The words tumbled out, my voice breaking. I told her about the cabin, the strange noises, the scratches, the broken door, the attack, the creature. Helen listened intently, her face growing paler and paler. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, staring into space. Then she said quietly that Uncle David, he'd complained about something similar shortly before he died. Talked about being scared, about someone or something watching him in the woods, about strange tracks around the house. She hadn't paid much attention at the time, chalked it up to his hermit lifestyle and eccentricities of age. Now her eyes were filled with horror and dawning realization. Maybe Uncle David's heart attack hadn't been entirely natural. At that moment, Cooper, who had been dozing at my feet, shot up. He growled, staring at the front door, fur bristling again. The same low, menacing growl as last night. I went cold. No, it couldn't be. It couldn't have found me here. So far from the woods, impossible. But Cooper wouldn't calm down. He whined, scrabbled at the floor, clearly sensing the same threat. Aunt Helen jumped up, her face contorted with fear. "What is it?" she whispered, moving towards the door. I yelled at her not to go near it, to stay put, but panic had already gripped her. She wanted to check the lock, or maybe look through the peephole. She threw the door open. Standing on the threshold was the thing, the Wendigo. The same desiccated figure, the same skull with antlers, the same stench of decay hit my nostrils. It looked even more grotesque in the morning sunlight. My aunt screamed, a short, terrified cry cut off mid-syllable. The creature lunged forward and grabbed her. I saw its clawed hands clamp down on Helen's shoulders, saw its fanged maw open. Terror paralyzed me, but only for an instant. The instinct for self-preservation roared louder than fear. While the monster was occupied with its victim, I grabbed Cooper, who was yelping and straining towards the door, and bolted for the back door in the kitchen. Behind me, I heard a horrific crunch and a wet, tearing sound, but I didn't dare look back. I slammed my shoulder into the back door, bursting out into the yard. I ran blindly across the neighbor's lawn, scrambled over a low fence. Cooper raced beside me, tail tucked. Behind us, I heard the creature's roar, filled with fury that its prey had escaped. I reached the nearest house with lights on, pounded on the door with all my strength, screaming for help. An elderly man with a shotgun answered, woken by the commotion. Seeing my state, the blood on Helen's porch visible from his own, he didn't hesitate to let me in and call the police. Police and paramedics arrived quickly. What they found in Helen's house made even seasoned officers turn pale. My aunt's body, or what was left of it, lay on the threshold. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle apart from an overturned chair in the kitchen, but the scene on the porch itself was monstrous. They took me to the station. The questioning was long and agonizing. I tried to explain what happened, told them about the creature from the woods, how it had stalked me, killed my uncle, and now my aunt. The detectives looked at me like I was crazy. They verified my story about the inheritance, about Uncle David's cabin. A patrol sent out there confirmed the ransacked interior, the broken door, and the strange scratches, but naturally found no creature. My clothes were taken for forensic analysis. A doctor examined me. I repeated my story over and over, but saw only disbelief and suspicion in the officer's eyes. I had no alibi for the time of my uncle's death, other than being a student in the city. Now my aunt was dead too. My uncle's inheritance had passed to me. Motive? Perhaps. But there was no proof. And the nature of Helen's injuries didn't fit any forensic profile. They were too savage, inhuman. Eventually, after hours of questioning, fact-checking, and the absence of any evidence linking me to the murder, they let me go. The official explanation for the incident, I gathered from overheard snippets, would likely be an attack by an unidentified wild animal, possibly a bear or cougar exhibiting abnormal behavior. The case was destined to become a cold one. I picked up Cooper from the temporary shelter where the police had placed him. My car, thankfully, was untouched outside Helen's house. I didn't go back inside, not even for my things. I couldn't. I just got behind the wheel, put Cooper in the passenger seat, and drove. Away from that town, away from Maine, away from those cursed woods. I called Aunt Mary, forcing out the news about Helen, telling her I had to leave, that I couldn't stay, that I'd explain later. I don't know if she understood anything, but her voice trembled with horror and grief. I'm far away from those places now. I rented a cheap motel room on the other side of the country. Cooper sleeps at my feet, still twitching in his sleep. I'm writing this, trying to impose order on the chaos in my head, to banish the haunting images, the glowing eyes, the stench of decay, Helen's face in her last moment of life. The police didn't believe me. Maybe no one will. But I know what I saw. I know it's real. I survived. My loyal dog Cooper survived too. We saved each other. But the scars remain, not just on Cooper's body, but in my soul. The losses are irreparable. The image of the Wendigo is burned into my memory forever. I don't know if there are others like it out there, in the vast northern forests. But I know one thing. If I ever find myself in the wilderness again, and hear a strange sound or feel an inexplicable dread, I won't ignore it. I'll turn around and walk away as far as I can. Because sometimes ancient legends turn out to be terrifyingly real, and the price of curiosity or disbelief can be far too high, and there's no one coming to help. Be careful. Trust your instincts, and never go into the woods alone.